Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
Me co-host Rich Cuvier here, and Doug, you've come up with a very interesting subject tonight. It's one of those subjects that sometimes it's hard to talk about because it's.
You know, I hate to talk about this.
I know, it really is. But the evidence is there. It's really a black mark on all of evolutionary thinking. They have distanced themselves quite a bit in recent years, or they've tried to. But the insurmountable evidence is, and most people don't even know how bad social Darwinistic problems and the idea of what evolution, what happened, what scientists did back in the 1800s, early 1800s, all the way through really I'd say the 1940s through the Hitler times. But we have a book here written by Jerry Bergman called The Darwin Effect, copiously footnoted. Jerry does incredible research. And there's a lot of stuff in there, and we're just going to touch on one aspect of it, right, Doug?
Yeah, we may delve in a little bit more of what this book is about, but basically Jerry is talking about instances where racism and eugenics and other social issues that came up, not so much prevalent as today, although in many cases it is, but these things were exacerbated.
Was that exaggerated and exacerbated?
Yeah.
Put a combination. I like that. I like, that's portmanteau words. I like those. You put two words together, make a third word.
And we're talking tonight about the Tasmanian genocide.
Right.
And this was something that occurred right around 1800 through the 1860s, 1870s, where as the British took over Australia and Tasmania, the natives who lived there were not treated very well.
Well, the thing what people don't really understand, we fully acknowledge, we know Darwin wrote his book in 1859, Origin of the Species, but the concept of an evolutionary kind of thinking had gone back for at least 50, 60 years. Late 1700s, his own grandfather Erasmus Darwin had a saying, he had a little logo, it said, "From shells, everything." The great chain of being, Doug, was sort of they were evolving into evolution, basically, into evolutionists.
And you know what, I sort of fault the church on this, because I think it was around the late 1700s that the idea of the gap theory came into being. Now, I didn't know it was this early that they started thinking this way, that there was a pre-Adamite race that preceded Adam and Eve.
Wait, this was, what time period was this?
This was late 1700s.
I didn't know it was that early either, because the first book I ever read was a book called Earth's Earliest Ages by Jesse Penn Lewis, and that's the most famous one when I was in my young Christian days, and it was it was like really awesome. You know, it's kind of cool looking, but it was all about a gap theory. But you know, Doug, it makes sense. The late 1700s, it seemed like a lot of filth, and the floodgates of hell seemed to be opened up about that time. All kinds of bad stuff started coming up, and obviously you talk about everything from the French Revolution to theosophy. You know, you got Darwinism, you got Charles Lyell and his long ages for the earth, and there's all kinds of stuff that's coming on during this particular period of time. So that doesn't surprise me, but I didn't know that. So that's an interesting fact.
And it's interesting, you know, evil is always been there. And there's always been rebellion against God, and there's always been people who've wanted to have an excuse to legitimately cut God out of the picture and to justify their actions.
Right.
And whether they wanted to justify their actions or not, they would. There's always this tendency towards doing what is evil, and so we have a little bit of the history of what happened, and we go back to the time when Tasmania was actually discovered by a Dutchman. His name was Abel Tasman.
Oh, that's why it's called Tasmania?
It's named after.
All right. Was 1642, 1640, somewhere around there?
Yeah, something of that age. And so they found Tasmania early, and basically the people who lived there were Melanesian. They were a lot of the same type of people that live in Australia and Papua New Guinea, and so they were considered savages by the Englishmen. Although they, when they first encountered them, they thought that the people were very. Let me read this. They found them to be with cheery dispositions, polite, kind, sincere, intelligent, and extremely skilled divers and fishermen.
You're talking about the late 1600s. The evolutionary type of thing had not really come into the existence yet. I mean, you got to, but by the next 100 years, things had changed. Is what you're saying? Okay.
And you know, in the early days, they were almost always positively regarded by the English colonists. So they thought that they were pretty interesting people, you know.
Yes.
And if you take a look at it, it is our commandment as Christians to go into all the world and reach every tribe and nation and culture for Jesus and to introduce them to the gospel.
Well, Doug, you know, we talk about things like that. Obviously, the stench of the church not doing anything, let's say in South Africa during all the apartheid things, you know, the church. What I tell people is, if the church doesn't really stand for truth and righteousness, the words of Jesus were right. If you don't, if the salt loses its saltiness, it's fit to be nothing but trampled on. And oftentimes that's why we get trampled on, because we don't stand up for truth. We end up being weasels, and we end up trying to compromise and we're so much about loving and tolerating, and that we let everything, the floodgates of filth, come in. And unfortunately, if the church doesn't stand up for righteousness, nobody else is going to.
And it starts out with maybe just a little simple error. Such as this, the gap theory.
The gap theory, okay.
If you're not familiar with the gap theory, it's the idea that between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 2, that you have a gap of a whole bunch of
millions and millions of years, however much time they want.
They put that gap there, presuming that there was a time that Satan ruled the earth, and there's a you know, he ruled the earth with his dark angels, and then came Adam was the created person that God designed to carry on the human race.
Right. It was a world that was ruined, and then it was ruined. Reconstruction Theory, as it's called. The idea, Doug, where demons came from was from these earlier beings that were disembodied souls, and that's why they want to possess a physical being. All that's a lot of malarkey, but I will say this to the gap theorists: they held on to that because the long ages were really coming into its own. Lyell with his principles of geology, and Hutton before him, and a few other ones that were writing about. They were already pushing it. Even some people who were creationists were talking about tranquil flood theories, and they were trying to say that the flood of Noah really didn't change anything. It was some earlier non-biblical flood, which no one's ever known. There's no evidence for.
You had Hutton who started out with his
James
ideas.
Hutton. I mentioned him. Yeah,
and then you would then Cuvier also had the tranquil flood ideas, and
Cuvier, as I understand it, was a believer, and he also was a creationist, but he was trying to make ideas of how all these layers could come up. This is long before, Doug, we kind of figured out really how plate tectonics work, and we don't fully know that either, but I mean, we have better ideas. Or evidence with Mount St. Helens. You know, we have all kinds of things that show how strata can get laid down very fast, and it's done through cataclysmic earth forces. But the point of it is that we're getting a little bit out in the sticks here. But the idea is the idea is that these ideas were building, and what happens is they culminated in the extermination of an entire people. And there are other peoples that were victims of this kind of thinking as well, as Jerry Bergman documents in his book, The Darwin Effect. So Doug, they started out looking at them as cheery, affable people. Then they suddenly decided they were hideous and ugly, and Europeans thought they were beneath them, and there's all this kind of class kind of system, you know. And the church kind of stood by and didn't do a lot. really didn't do anything, okay? And then the rot of evolution began to come in, or the idea that the Bible really didn't mean what it said fully.
Well, what happened was that there was a first skirmish that occurred where a British soldier who was drunk decided that he was going to give the order to fire on the Tasmanians.
Oh, really?
And so they opened fire on the group of Tasmanians, killed about 50 of them, and that resulted in a lot of animosity from the Tasmanians.
You think?
Might, and so you had. This is how things start. Is you get now you get people mad at each other, and you get a war started, and it resulted in many petty encounters where, and in each of these the natives were continuously defeated.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like the Indians here in the United States. I mean, Europe had the technology. You know, you got gunpowder. You got rifles. The Iroquois were the baddest dudes in the block until the English and the French came in and pretty much took it to them with their guns. They couldn't stop them. Well, the Tasmanians, I don't even know. Would they have a few spears, maybe bow and arrows? What they have? And I don't even know what they used as weaponry. You know, probably to hunt and fish. But yeah, they're no match for gunpowder.
No, they weren't.
For rifles.
And that was the problem. Is that the whites kidnapped the children and made them laborers, and then. Had the women as consorts or wives, and the mutilated or killed the men, and they tried to clear them off the land. And so eventually to reduce the population to like 72 adult men, 3 adult women, and no children. And then they placed a bounty on them. I guess during that time they they sort of started a sport of abo hunting.
Well, is that short for Aborigine hunting?
Hunting for Aborigines.
Okay. Because the Tasmanian people, as I understand you, they didn't really look like the Aborigines of Australia, though. They didn't.
No, they were sort of like their own. They had 70 different tribes.
Yeah. Okay.
And so even amongst themselves, they had their own
differences. Okay, but they were generally darker skinned.
Right.
I would say. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they didn't have the curly hair, as I understand. They were kind of more. Their hair straighter. It's kind of more like reminds me of some of the Polynesian kind of people.
Yeah, they were
darker skinned. I'm not really sure, but anyway. But go ahead. Yeah.
And so they put them in, made them slaves. They did what they call black catching. They'd set traps for them. They'd poison them, and they set a bounty for them. And so
they used didn't they poison with
strychnine? Yeah. And so there were a number of Christians who attempted to help them, but it turned out that there was a little bit too little and too late when this is going on.
I know.
Now you have to understand that the culture of Australia was also conducive to some of this, because this is where they would ship out their convicts.
Yep, Australia was originally was that Botany Bay? Where is that? It was basically the whole island was
Bounty Bay or something,
or Botany or whatever it was. Anyway, the thing is, that's what Australia. Most of the descendants, well, you got migration now, but I mean, originally were all convicts. They were sent from England, I guess, weren't they? Yeah, England. That was an English prison island, is what it was. So, did some of these people were some of the ones that were going? Yeah,
they were the ones making a game out of raping and disfiguring the Tasmanian women and killing and mutilating the men.
And Doug, that goes back to your point earlier. We're not trying to link everything to evolutionary bias. Evolution just gives it a validation that it shouldn't have. Sin has existed without evolution. You don't need that. Sin just basically is because we're a fallen group of people. And since Cain killed Abel, we figured out one form or another to justify trying to kill somebody because we don't like the way they look. Well, we don't like the way they act. We don't like how come they're accepted and we're not, or whatever jealousy reason we use. But evolution basically codified it and gave it a scientific backing that made it almost not only justified but a preferred method. I mean, going out and doing some of this stuff was not only not frowned upon, but Doug, after they were done, weren't they trying to use some of these Tasmanians as specimens for some things? Weren't they trying to?
Yeah, well, one of the things that they wanted to do once they killed the Tasmanian is that they would boil down to the skeleton and then use the skeleton in their museums. Darwin positioned the Tasmanians as a crucial proof of his theories, along with the people from Tierra del Fuego. The problem was that they were hard to convert to Christianity. That was one of the things that Darwin was. He actually supported the mission to the Fuegans.
I heard about that.
Yeah, he kept sending him money, even though he was realizing that they were actually doing some good to them.
Okay.
He, with his theory, he didn't believe that anything that the Christians were doing.
Yeah, he's kind of a strange character. Do you think the mission money was something that he had, maybe in his heart he was there, or do you think it might because of his wife a little bit influencing him?
Emma was, for all intents and purposes, a Christian.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
It was interesting. She had written a couple of books. Jerry Bergman has a couple of her books that she had written.
Okay.
And they are actually pretty spiritual books, apparently. And so,
how did that go along? Wow.
Why she ended up staying with him is a real test of Christian character, I guess.
I know. I don't get it either. But because all accounts, Darwin became more entrenched in his atheism as he got older and older. We've debunked that Lady Hope story over the years. It's been debunked many times, but that Darwin converted on his deathbed. There's absolutely no evidence for that. In fact, there's some evidence to the contrary, including testimony by his own son or grandsons, that talked about what he was like. But that aside, Doug, what I was amazed at was the idea. We've talked about Topanga before. Now, he's not a Tasmanian. He's from Africa, a pygmy.
A pygmy from Africa,
and he was actually put in the St. Louis Zoo. He had somewhat freedom. He was sort of kind of a pop icon in one sense, but he was actually put in there as a primitive savage, showing the missing link between the gorilla and, let's say, the white race, or the Teutonic race, as they used to say.
They put him in the same cage with the monkey,
or next to it, I think is what it was. But
and they would, and he was tormented by the people around him, and I guess he fashioned a bow and arrow and started shooting arrows at some of the onlookers.
I know, yeah.
And that story is in Jerry Bergman's book, Darwin Effect. I do highly recommend this book if you want a good history of.
It's not only good history, but it's interesting reading, Doug. It's actually very entertainingly written, I thought. So it's not a dry treatise, although he has all the facts there. But boy, when you read some of this stuff, you go, oh my gosh. Even evolutionists have said, evolution is the acid rotting, rotting the fabric of society. And it does, it rots everything. And I don't understand why people want to hold on to that theory, because it has nothing good to commend it. And based on Darwin did not know about DNA and all that kind of stuff, and all the idea that gross morphological differences, we found out from genetics, they're very minor.
That's right.
The darkest and most curliest and thick-lipped aborigine is very closely related to the palest, white-skinned, thin-lipped Swede. They're not that much different. Okay?
No, they aren't.
And the fact of the matter is, they can intermarry and produce viable and children who are also viable, who can produce offspring themselves. We don't
not only viable, but often sometimes very beautiful.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I should tell Doug, you married a Chinese gal, and your kids are gorgeous. They're very, very. I don't know. They took more after their mom than you, I think. No, I'm kidding. I had to jazz them. That's all. No, but they really turn out quite lovely, and they're really good human beings. But they're very, very good. And of course, we talked about the Polynesian Islands. And they've got pretty much a hybrid of every white, black, Oriental. I can't even say. Somebody said you can't use Oriental anymore. You got to use Asian, I guess. But what if they're not Asian?
But what if they're bald?
What if it's just anyway, the point of it is that they're all, everybody stopped.
That's an inside joke.
Yeah, it's an inside joke. We won't get into that, but from years and years ago when I was a young kid. But anyway, so Doug, the Tasmanian people, the last woman was 1876. Is that correct?
That's when she died. Actually, there was another one that claimed to still be the last Tasmanian. She died in 1881.
After that, okay. All right.
But there, in 1830, 30 years after the British settled Tasmania, the last 135 Tasmanians of the population were rounded up and they were transported to Flinders Island, which is nearby. And there was a fellow by the name of George Augustus Robinson who attempted to save the last remaining Tasmanians. And he was a fervent Christian and was not convinced that they were not beyond salvation.
You know, Doug, I'd like to know how he did some of his missionary stuff. We've found out as creationists some of the best ways to convert people is to talk about our common origin from Adam and Eve.
Right.
When you go to the book of Genesis, they see a commonality where oftentimes the church goes in like, we have all the wise things, you're the ignorant savages. No, you basically maybe have lost stuff, and we've been lucky to gain. We've lost things too, but the point of it is when they talk about stories like Noah's flood or the Tower of Babel or the creation of the first man and woman, oftentimes the same stories in sometimes muddled or even mythologized type of forms, they can recognize these stories in their own culture. And I have a feeling he was probably not very effective, as I understand it, right?
No, apparently he wasn't much of an administrator, and so financially the whole thing fell apart.
Well, that's
and so there was a bunch of when you're trying to be a missionary, you have to almost be good at everything that you do. It's a tough thing. I have a friend who actually is responsible for straightening me out when I was in college.
Really?
Yeah, and his name is Barry Makel, and he currently is a missionary to in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
But actually, he's in a different area now. He's working in one of the islands in the Solomon Sea.
Oh, really?
The island, there's two islands next to each other. There's Buka, which is up to the north.
Okay.
And then Bougainville is a longer island. It's about 150 miles long.
Now, do you buy Papua New Guinea? Or
they're hundreds of miles out in the sea, but it's part of Papua New Guinea.
How long has he been out there?
He's been out there for maybe 4 or 5 years.
Really? I did not know that. Yeah.
And the island of Buka has 3 languages on it, and it's just a little tiny island, you know. And so here's a language group up here, one down here, another down here.
Wow.
But on Bougainville, there's 18 different languages, and that's about 35 miles wide and 150 miles long. And so it's a long, narrow island. But here you have these
multiple languages too.
It does 18 different languages on Bougainville.
Wow. Okay.
And so here he's dealing with 21 different languges in this particular area.
Now, even though he's a missionary, but he's a Bible translator.
He's with Wycliffe Bible Translator.
So that's a big part of it. You know, getting the Bible into their own culture.
And so not only he has to learn these languages, but the cultures as well. You know. And I guess that he has guys coming to his school there. They actually come in by boat from some of the Solomon Islands nearby. And so all these islanders have their own little cultures, and they get together with the translators to learn how to translate their own do the translations themselves.
Well, Doug, what a counterpoint to the evolutionary scenario, or even the sin scenario, which evolution basically promoted. It made it even worse. But the fact is that the Christian missionary is trying to really understands these people as individuals made in the image of God, fallen, maybe lost, whatever. Some of them Christian, some of them, a lot of them probably not, but. Whereas the other ones, they're treated as inferior beings. They're lesser humans, or not even humans at all in the old days. See, as I say, Darwinism has gotten away from social Darwinism. But your ugly past is there. You can't just whitewash and pretend it's not there, because it is a natural inclination for people to lord it over people in some form or another, thinking they're better than you are. This is what people do. This is a natural inclination for some people to want to be higher than you, and evolution allowed that in a scientific framework to become codified as policy, because basically science says people evolved upward. We're the highest race, you're the lowest race, because look at our technology, look at our arts, look at our this and that and the other thing. And so all of that served a bad end, where your friend Barry Makel, Doug, he's there, and missionaries like the guy, even though he wasn't effective, he taught that these people were made in the image of God, not lesser beings. This is a diametrically opposed viewpoint here.
And what is different about what Barry is doing is that he is employing the people there to help them learn how to do it themselves, treating them with respect, that they're able to be educated in order to do this, and Bible translation is a complicated matter, and when you get right down to it, each language is a complicated thing to figure out.
I don't want to do it, Doug.
And I have enough trouble trying to keep up with all the computer languages. I have to keep relearning and relearning. They're still foreign
languages to me,
And so it's a difficult thing that people have to do, and you have to realize the native peoples also have their own sin baggage to deal with. Isn't that they're free from any of this as well? They have their own things that they have to overcome, and they need to be taught that Jesus loves them, that he died for their sins, that there is a cure. They know what the right and wrong is, and that they also know that they need to be redeemed from this evil that encompasses their life. And we don't like the fact that all this evil exists around us, and so Christianity offers a new perspective upon how to deal with sin and its nature, and get rid of it out of your life.
Doug, I tell you, we're almost done, but there's a book called Eternity in Their Hearts, which talks about missionaries in the past who came out to some of these cultures, and oftentimes they would find certain commonalities in ways that were just remarkable. I'm not going to go into it because we're running out of time, but it's an amazing book, and the different perspective between the Darwinian viewpoint and the Christian viewpoint is just 180 degrees opposite. One creates life, one creates death.
We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.